My name is Iain MacGregor. I'm a historian and a publisher. I've been a publisher for about 30 years here in the UK in London. I've worked at several big international publishers, one of which was Simon & Schuster, obviously, based in New York. And I've been lucky enough to work with major historians, both in the UK and in the USA. So in the USA, people like William Taubman, David Gran, Sir Max Hastings in the UK, Simon Schama. But as a historian in my own right, I'm a fellow of the Royal Historical Society. I've got a love of pretty much 20th century onwards history, and I've always been fascinated by Eastern Europe and the conflict, political, economic, and military throughout Russia's life, I suppose, in the 20th century, and now going into where we are today and what's going on in the Ukraine. I was very lucky that I had a forward-thinking father and mother. They sent me on several trips to Europe and Eastern Europe in the early 80s when I was a teenager that was developing a love for history. So in 1981, I was on a student exchange to Stalingrad, as was. We all know it as St. Petersburg. And that really grew my love for that. When I say love, I mean history of the country. And that's developed over the years. So my degree was on European history. My dissertation was on the Prague Spring in the 1960s in Czechoslovakia. And then a lot of my publishing as well, over the years. I've done lots and lots on Eastern Europe and Russia. And then what we're going to talk about today, Stalingrad. I mean, I've published over a dozen books on what's called the Great Patriotic War. I'm sure a lot of you know that. But I've done lots in the West as well. So I was privileged to publish all of Stephen Ambrose's books over the years at Simon & Schuster, of course, one of which is Band of Brothers. But to get into my book, Stalingrad, I've been fascinated by the battle, always have been, since I was probably 9 years old. I think was the first time I read about it. The biggest battle in terms of combatants and casualties, dead, wounded, destruction, number of shells and bullets expended, that kind of thing. Huge clash of armies. And one could argue that it was the turning point of the war on continental Europe, or on the Eastern Front. Obviously, many major battles came after it. But I would argue, as I do in my book, The Lighthouse of Stalingrad, is that it was psychologically, it was a turning point. There were many more battles to come, like I said, that were very touch and go at the time. But the Russians, or the Soviets, I should say, I should call them the Soviets in this talk, because that's what they were. They were the army was made up of all the 15 republics. But Stalingrad was the turning point in terms of it stopped the Germans in their tracks. And it was the first time the Soviets could actually look at themselves in the mirror and say, we won this battle. We completely defeated them, and we've captured, look what we've captured. We've destroyed an army. We've captured well over 250, 300,000 men. But what my book also talks about, which is what I'm going to talk about in the presentation, is the use of propaganda and myth that can turn into legend. And once the war had ended and we go into the Cold War over the decades, some of these myths and legends, one of which is the title of my book, The Lighthouse, that becomes taken as fact. And that was the story of my research going to Russia in 2020. In lockdown, I managed to get a professional travel visa to dig into the archives, read the first-hand testimonies of both Soviet troops and German troops, and try and find the truth. So to get on to what we're going to talk about, it's basically Stalingrad is obviously, I would imagine all of you know the story or the name of Stalingrad. Huge city, amazing, incredible battle, incredible victory for the Soviet Union. But after the war, everyone had a piece of the action, so to speak. And Stalingrad, because you could have been living in New York, Los Angeles, anywhere in between. You could have been in Delhi, Cape Town, obviously London, Auckland, anywhere around the Western world. All the newspapers, if you go into the archives, you'll see it yourself. If you go into the archives, New York Times, Los Angeles Herald, London Times, etc., every single day they were doing some kind of report, normally on the front page, of what was going on during those 5 months of the Battle of Stalingrad, from beginning of September 1942, through to the capitulation at the end of January 1943. And it was covered, the whole world knew about it. So at the end of the war, like I said, it was a great celebration, because we were still the Allies up until that point. The Cold War hadn't started yet. That would be another couple of years further down the line. So as I try and show in the talks that I give, for instance, some of the photos you'll see is Stalingrad, for instance, There's avenues, boulevards, and streets. Over 150 towns, cities, and villages in France, for instance, have something named after Stalingrad. The Paris Metro has one station named after Stalingrad, and that's just France. And that was the same mirrored throughout Eastern Europe as well. You could go to Bulgaria, Romania, all the countries that had been taken over by the Soviet Union's Red Army and then consolidated into what we would know as the Warsaw Pact. All those countries had similar things: parks, buildings and avenues, boulevards, etc., all named after either the battle or the heroes on the Soviet side of the battle. That may have changed now, obviously, since the Cold War finished in the 1990s, but that's the thing. And on my trip, like I said, I went in the winter, in November, and it was about -18, -20 at the time, and that was good from a writing historian's perspective. It was great for me, because I wanted to kind of get to feel what must it have been like for the combatants in this city in that kind of conditions. And it still wasn't as cold as it was in the fighting. I mean, but in some parts of the battle during the winter, the temperatures dropped to at least -30. It was about -20 when I was there, -18, -20. But again, as you can see from the photos that I took when I was there, all over the city, it's a giant battlefield. That's the thing. And to Russians and to those from the Soviet Union who want to come and visit Volgograd, that's its name now. It changed its name from Stalingrad to Volgograd in the 1960s by order of Nikita Khrushchev. You can't help. You can walk down any street and you will find enormous statues and commemorations of the losses. Because as again, some of you might know this, the level of casualties and dead were enormous, bigger than Verdun from or the Somme from the Great War, and these statues, you have to see them to see how big they are. They're enormous. They range from 30 to 50 to 60 foot high. You can see an infantryman holding the very typical anti-tank rifle, which thousands were used in the Battle of Stalingrad and throughout the war, really, against German panzers. That's outside the grain elevator, and that's in the south of Stalingrad, and that was where the earliest fighting was, because it went in phases. And at the beginning of the battle, throughout September, the September battles, as it's called, the Germans were mainly trying to capture the south of the city. Then they were going to capture the center of the city. And then the fiercest fighting was done for famously for the factory districts in the north. And Stalingrad was huge. It's probably about 25 miles long. So that's about 40 kilometers long. It's like a ribbon that hugged the River Volga. The mighty River Volga, very much like the Mississippi is to the USA, is an arterial river, hugely important for economic and transportation reasons, and that's why the Germans wanted it. But so you've got it's a huge city to take. Then you've got what I think is quite an emotive statue, and again, it's about 30, 40 foot high, and that's showing three figures. They're young figures, and they represent Komsomol. And what that is Komsomol is basically Young Communists, the Young Communist League. And because the German forces got to the city and caught the Russians by surprise, because they were falling back so quickly, the Sixth Army that was there thought they were going to take the city quite quickly. But what they did was the Red Army defenders were throwing in any forces that they could get, just to try and stem the tide until reinforcements arrived. So it was either the 10,000 men of the NKVD division, which is the security police. They put up a hell of a fight. But the young communists, there were tens of thousands of them, and they were pushed into the meat grinder straight away. So this statue that you see here is a young girl saying goodbye, probably to her older brother, with the younger brother standing behind. And he's armed with the very famous PCS-H-41 submachine gun, which was produced in their millions for the Russians, was very effective for the urban fighting in Stalingrad. And he's saying goodbye. But in those September battles, nearly 20,000 Komsomol members died. And so you're walking down this street, and as you can see from my photograph, that's just down an ordinary street. It's not even in a big boulevard or park. It's just been built in the middle of the street, cars going either side. And as you can see in the background, there's just blocks of flats. But I wanted to show you that photo because that represents the city itself. You can go down dozens and dozens of streets and you'll just be faced with some enormous statue that represents casualties and sacrifice, really. But the Lighthouse of Stalingrad, which is what my book's called, it relates to what is probably the most famous story to come out of the Battle of Stalingrad, and that's Pavlov's house. And again, some of you might know the name, you might know the story even. If you go on Google, you will find the typical or the legend that was built up from it. So I've given you two photos. The photo on the left is obviously what it looked like at the end of the war. It was basically what it was a 4-story apartment block, housed probably had about 60 to 80 apartments in it, and then it had a reinforced cellar. And it was one of the buildings for the elite. So if you're an elite in the local Communist Party, or you're one of the technicians, the engineers or physicists or armaments, chemical workers, managers that worked in the factory district to the north, this was one of the apartments that you would be given. And you know you'd arrived because it had hot and cold running water. It was fitted with the latest gas and electric appliances. And it was a great place to live during, well, obviously not during, before the war started. But by the time we get to where the legend of Pavlov's house comes into, by the end of September, so a month of fighting in Stalingrad, like the rest of the city, it's been bombed and shelled mercilessly by the Germans. But because it had reinforced girders in the building, it was one building in the 8% of buildings within the heart of the city that survived this terrible carnage. But it just meant it was another one of those buildings where you get the famous scenes where they're fighting house to house. So this building happened to be, in no man's land. Between the Germans nearly had most of the central part of the city by the time the legend of Pavlov's house came up, and that was the fight for it. And the photo you can see on the right is how it looks today. So the apartment block, like the rest of the city, had been rebuilt, but because there's a legend to this building, which I will talk to you about as we go through. What they did was they kept a small section of the original building on the end of the building, and that's what you can see from the photo. But to an everyday Russian today, this is as famous as the Alamo is to you, or I would imagine Rorke's Drift in South Africa is to a British, a fan of British military history, where you had the famous standoff of the British Army against the Zulu Army. It's a place of valor, sacrifice, and victory against the odds. That's how the legend goes. And that's what I wanted to find out. Did this really happen? Because I've heard lots of stories that you shouldn't believe all you hear, that 28 men led by Sergeant Pavlov held this house against the might of a whole German division. The German division, we're talking anywhere between 6,500, what was left, or it might have been even more, 9,000 men, fully supported by air and panzer strikes. And they held it for 58 days. That's the legend. If you look at this next picture, this is the Panorama Museum, and it's on the banks of the Volga. An amazing view. If you got your back to that museum and you're looking out, you've just basically got this enormous river, bigger than the Mississippi, wider than the Mississippi, and beyond that you're going into Asia. And that picture really hasn't changed since German panzer commanders were atop their tank looking at the east, I suppose. And the Panorama Museum was set up in the 1950s alongside lots of other museums that were popping up around the Soviet Union. And its aim really was, and this is after the time of Stalin, so Stalin died in 53, Khrushchev was in firm control by 1956, and so the Panorama Museum was well underway by then. And what they wanted to do was, I suppose, try and collect as many testimonies of who had fought in this amazing victory and this incredible battle. Because like I said at the beginning, and you can see it today with Putin and the way he talks about the sacrifices that Russia, he always talks about Russia more than anything else, have made to win the Second World War. The pillar, one of the main pillars of what Russia thinks of itself in the Second World War is Stalingrad. And one of the main pillars within the Battle of Stalingrad is Pavlov's house. So what the museum wanted to do was they put a national campaign out in newspapers, on radio broadcasts, saying, did you fight at Stalingrad? And there would have been, hundreds of thousands of survivors that had. We would like to hear from you. Tell us what unit you were in, where you fought, and what your experiences were. And in lots of cases, a lot of people just wrote letters, but those that wanted to leave more of a testimony were sent these school books, these green school books, 48 pages. And lined. And so when I went to the archives, and I'd spent weeks and weeks contacting the director of the archives to say, this is the story I want to tell. These are the units I'm looking to look at that were around Pavlov's house. These are the names that I've so far found. Is it possible I can look at anything they might have donated? And he brilliantly managed to locate hundreds and hundreds of files. And these were files that no one really had looked at. So they'd been donated from about 1955, 56, all the way through to about the beginning of the 1970s. And that's when it kind of tailed off the need to get all these testimonies in place. But I really could have looked at thousands of files. But I was there for over a week, and I managed to look at roughly 800 testimonies with a translator, a local Russian historian who's now a very good friend of mine, and we spent hours and hours every day going through the files, figuring out which ones we wanted to record, because later it was a very long process. It took another 6 months to get everything translated accurately and correctly. And then for me to have that material, it was roughly about 180,000 words I came away with. And then I've distilled that and tried to work it into the narrative that I've told in the book. Barbarossa had happened in June 1941. It was Hitler's big gamble to knock the Red Army out of the Second World War in one campaign, as he had done to France the year before. He hoped to do the same with the Red Army, even though it was far bigger than what the German armed forces were. But still, the invasion caught them on the hop. Stalin didn't believe he was going to get attacked on this level. 3 huge army groups numbering well over 3 million men, over 3,000 aircraft, and huge motorized panzer armies thrusting their way through into Russia. But then they got stopped outside the gates of Moscow, but also along a whole frontier now that stretched well over 1,500 kilometers from the Baltic all the way down towards southern Russia and past the Ukraine. And then they were hit by the Soviet winter too. A lot more German soldiers dropped out of the line with frostbite more than anything else. But by the time it came to Hitler saved his army, I should say, with a Soviet counteroffensive outside the gates of Moscow during the end of November, going through to December and into January 42. He managed to save his army by telling them to stand and fight and form huge kessels within the Soviet encirclements that were pushing through the line. And that worked because he managed to save his army with airdrops and relieve them. And also the Soviet forces were worn out, and they weren't in the condition they would be further into the war. But the policy of Hitler ordering his commanders to stand and fight and await relief, it worked that time. But as we'll see in this presentation, it would then have disastrous consequences by the time we get to Stalingrad. So the next photo you're looking at is Hitler in the spring of 1942, and he's standing with his commanders thinking, where can we attack now? By December 41, when they were suffering this surprise attack anyway from Soviet forces outside the gates of Moscow, he joined Imperial Japan by declaring war on the United States. And now we're talking about a global war. He knew, he's not stupid, he knows he's in a global war, and what he needs is to make sure he guarantees his supply of minerals and fuel to keep his war machine going. He's thinking long term. He's thinking this war is now going to go on for several years at least. I need to be in a position that I might not win the thing. Now I've got all these allies ranged against me, but I'm certainly not going to lose it. That's what I need. So while he's standing there looking at the map, he's talking to his commanders about what could they do. They can't do Operation Barbarossa again. They can't repeat it. They haven't got the men. They haven't got the material. They've lost well over 1 million men from Barbarossa. Their tank armies have been destroyed to a degree. A great many of them were in the repair shop, but they needed time to rebuild. So there was a great argument in Supreme Headquarters with Hitler. One argument was we need to bed down, defend all through 1942 and really rebuild our strength for the final battle. But Hitler's argument was, I'm in this global war now. I've got to secure the oil that I need to keep my war machine going. That's in southern Russia. That's in the Caucasus, places like Maikop and Grozny. If we get that, we guarantee ourselves our own oil supply, and we deny it to the enemy. And it might well force Stalin to the table to either sue for peace, or we can actually break them and we'll win. He was still racially, he was guided by his own doctrine that he was facing an inferior enemy. He didn't believe that there were millions more really well-trained men and T-34 tanks and KV-1 tanks and the rebuilt Soviet Air Force would be coming online within a year. He just didn't think the Russians were capable of that. So that was driving his policy as well. So it was a huge throw of the dice. And as we see from this map that you'll see now, what it was Case Blue, which would be launched at the end of June, beginning of July 1942, was his roll of the dice, really, to see if he could plunge into the parts of southern Russia he hadn't captured during Barbarossa, launch pad from Ukraine, because they had most of Ukraine. They had the breadbasket of Ukraine now. The whole operation this time was to seize the oil fields of the Caucasus. So it was in 4 phases. It was to push through and capture the main transportation hubs, such as Rostov, get there, pushed to Stalingrad, but pushed to the Volga. That was purely just a strategic move, just to get them protect their flank. The main bulk of the army, well over 1 million men and well over 1,500 tanks and motorized units, was to plunge into the south en masse and take the Caucasus, or as much as the Caucasus as they could, and take the oil fields. And that was the plan. It was going to be done in very strict phases. It had been well worked out. But as we see, as the army would come up against fiercer fighting and fiercer defending that they thought the Soviets were capable of, they started losing troops, they started losing tanks. The movement, the hundreds and hundreds of kilometers their armored formations had to get down south started to stall, and Hitler needed a victory. So by August, the Operation Case Blue has been going for about 7 weeks. They are succeeding, but this time, instead of the Soviets standing and fighting, and so they could be encircled and hundreds of thousands of them could be captured, as what had happened the year before and what Hitler was expecting this year, I think Stalin by this time had seen sense. He was trusting his military commanders more, far more than Hitler trusted his. And he was agreeing with the policy that someone like Marshal Zhukov, who's the great military strategist of the Second World War for the Soviet Union, he was arguing the point where we have to be able to tell our men to pull back strategically and not stand and uselessly fight and lose the position anyway and be captured. We can't keep doing this. And that's what they were implementing. But this lulled Hitler into a false sense of security in terms of he thought he could have it all in one go. He thought the disappearing Soviet forces told him that they had no forces left. And so now he split his army in two. Half of it, Army Group B, would push east and go towards the Volga. The other half would continue on the push down south. But that's where they were now stumbling and meeting fiercer resistance as they got closer to the oil fields, which the Russians blew up anyway. So it would have taken months and months for the Germans, even if they had captured them, to get them online to actually get the oil because they've been blown up. But so by the time we get to August, mid-August, they're stalling in the Caucasus, and now Hitler's believing, I need to get something from this campaign. The German people will know, judging by all their loved ones that won't be returning because I've lost so many men in this campaign alone, we need to have something. And so all eyes were now turning to Stalingrad. He wanted to take Stalin's city, this showpiece city. And I've got you a couple of photos here to show you what it looked like. I don't know whether many of you know this, but arguably, I mean, the city itself, it'd been there since the Middle Ages. It was a trading post because it was along the river, and it just happened to be in the right geographical point where over the centuries it would develop and grow and expand. But even by I'd say the end of the Russia's part in the First World War and the beginning of the Russian Civil War, it was still probably only about 70 to 80,000 people in the population. It was primarily a transportation hub, but it was big. It had huge warehouses that were full of grain that was being shipped up north to places like Moscow and further north there. But it would be in the 20s and the 30s that it would massively develop and massively expand, because by then the communists were in charge. Stalin was the leader, a very savvy local communist leader in the city, because it was called Tsaritsyn, named after the Tsar. But they wanted to change it, and they changed it to Stalingrad, to be named after Stalin himself. And it was one of several cities that Stalin had pinpointed that the new economic plans that they had in place during the 20s and into the 30s that would be supported with foreign money. I mean, all the great factories that were built around Stalingrad were financed really by American money. And so there were huge investments. And the Ford Motor Company, for instance, helped build the big tractor factories in Stalingrad. And so it was a model city. It had a lot of things that the majority of Soviet cities at the time didn't. It had lovely boulevards, parks, theatres, libraries, good schools. As I showed you with Pavlov's house, it had apartment blocks with fresh, hot and cold running water, gas and electricity. These were the things that most Soviet citizens would only dream about having. But Stalingrad was seen as, this is the future. This is the Soviet type city that we will build all across Russia. And like I said, the factory district was the key thing of the city, and that drove the increase in the population. So by the time the Germans arrived, the normal population of Stalingrad had increased from 80,000 by the end of the First World War to where the Germans at the Second World War, it was roughly around 400, just over 400,000 people. But that had massively increased because of all the refugees fleeing from the West in the tail end of the German advance during that summer of 42. So by the time the Germans arrived, there's roughly around 800,000 people in the city. A lot of them would be evacuated, but Stalin did refuse a great many of them freedom of movement, because he was convinced that the soldiers and the citizens themselves would fight for a living city. If it was a dead city and everyone wasn't there, why would you fight for it? You wouldn't retreat. So he thought, if we keep the civilians there, that's what's going to happen. The next image, you can see this victorious German Sixth Army marching its way forward. And the photo on the left of the young infantrymen of the Sixth Army marching along, they're always the last to come along. So the Luftwaffe, as you'll see from the next photo, the Luftwaffe reached Stalingrad last week of August and proceeded to bomb it to pieces. Which is obviously famously turned it into a perfect ambush center for the Red Army defenders. But that's remember the photo you see there, because that's them fresh-faced, and this was used by Nazi propagandists to show that they were just victorious. And the Sixth Army was. I mean, they were called. Their nickname was the Conqueror of Capitals, because up until the beginning of the war on the Eastern Front, the Sixth Army had been in the vanguard of most of the major German advances in the West. In France, in the Low Countries, and tackling the British Army in France as well, and they've been victorious. The photo on the right is Field Marshal Paulus, or General Paulus as he was then, and he's looking through his binoculars at the city, and he was a worried man, because he was thinking it was bigger than he thought, it was longer than he thought, and his worries that I read when I was looking at his private papers was, can I take this city? But he was confident to a degree, because, as this next picture shows, he had the strength of the Luftwaffe behind him, and that was the strongest arm of the German armed forces during that summer. They paved the way for the Sixth Army's advance through to Stalingrad. They carpet bombed the defending Red Army forces that were there, and there's a great many of them. And then they bombed the city. And by the time the Germans were investing the city at the beginning of September, that would start the battle, the Luftwaffe had bombed or reduced to rubble about 95% of the city itself. And like I said, that's a city that's about 40 kilometers in length, and they destroyed 95% of it. But as we see, it turned it into a lunar landscape, perfect for infantry that are well armed to defend it, very, very difficult for motorized formations that are trying to capture it. So another part of my research was, I had as I just showed you, I had the Russian side pretty much nailed down because of my trip to Russia. But in lockdown, there was more stricter guidelines for historians trying to do research abroad in Western Europe. So I couldn't go to Germany. All the museums were closed anyway. I wouldn't have been able to go. So to get around that, what I did was I placed, my story focuses on two opposing divisions. The 13th Guards Rifle Division, which guarded the centre of the city. If any of you have seen Enemy at the Gates with Jude Law, that's the division he wrote in. The film is complete hokum, but that's the division. That division did exist, and that's the division that's famous in Russia for saving the centre of the city. But it fought primarily throughout those long months of the battle against one or two divisions, primarily the 71st Infantry Division, which is what I talk about. And so that division's from southern Germany. So I basically placed adverts in the local newspapers in southern Germany, in Saxony as well, and just said, did you have a loved one that fought in the 71st Division at Stalingrad? If so, please contact me and explain what I was doing. And I probably got around 30 to 35 replies over about a 6-month period via email. And of those, and this is this photo you can see, by far and away, the most amazing find was this man here. On the left-hand side, he's an officer. The photo that shows him there, he's a lieutenant colonel. His name's Fritz Rosker, and his story is incredible, and it's never been told before. He arrived to take command of a key regiment within the 71st Division. He led the very first advance into the city, which was hugely successful, which caused panic and mayhem in Moscow. Stalin couldn't believe the Germans had got to the River Volga so quickly and cut their way through his defences of the city. But then this guy Rosker survived the next 4 months of intense, bitter fighting in the city itself. He was the one who actually surrendered the Sixth Army at Stalingrad. All the history books you've read always talk about, well, Paulus surrendered, the field marshal. He was made a field marshal just before he surrendered. He surrendered the Sixth Army. But judging by Rosker's diaries and letters he sent home to his wife, which still survived, he actually was in command of the final Kessel, the final redoubt in the centre of the city. And he choreographed and organised the final surrender. And his story is amazing. He then surrendered alongside with others. There would be roughly about 90,000 German and Axis troops surrendered to the Russians that were left. And of those, only about 5,000 ever made it back in the mid-50s. And he was one of them. He was on one of the last transports to come back to West Germany in 1955, the summer of 1955. And then he spent the next 9 to 10 months putting his personal papers together, writing out a longhand memoir of about 15,000 words, got all his photos, got all his hand-drawn maps. He was a trained architect. He'd actually worked in the late 20s. He worked in Manhattan for an architectural practice. And then he'd gone home in the 30s to rejoin the army. But put all that paperwork together, put it in a briefcase, and then sadly, tragically, hung himself on Christmas Day, 1956. And he left his wife and 5 children. And his youngest surviving son, who's now 82, as I speak, I've been in contact with him for at least two and a half years now. He saw my advert and sent me all the material and said, "I'm sure you'd like to read this because no one's ever published it before. No one's seen it." And so Fritz Roska is one of the main characters in my book, and it gives a very, very interesting and different perspective of what it was like to lead a formation in this intense struggle in the battle, and also what it was like at the end. The next series of photos on the left-hand side is General Vasily Churkov, and he is seen quite rightly as the victorious leader of the defense of the heart of the city of Stalingrad, the 62nd Army, who withstood the might of the 6th Army, who were trying to capture the city. And the gentleman on the right-hand side is Major General Alexander Radimtsev, and he was in charge of the 13th Guards Rifle Division. So you've got to remember, like I was saying right at the beginning, the city was defended, but it was grabbing any kind of unit it could until the main formations that had been guarding the center of Russia and primarily around the area of Moscow, because Stalin had expected the summer offensive, they'd be attacking Moscow again. So the bulk of the best troops were hundreds and hundreds of bedded in hundreds of kilometers around that area. They were being sent down south as they realized the Germans are going south. They're after the oil in the Caucasus. So these divisions were heading south and they were coming into the city on the eastern bank of the Volga on echelon. So as they arrived, they were just sent into the meat grinder. And so Radimtsev's 13th Guards, they arrived just as the Germans had taken the riverbank, and they were immediately, all 10,000 of them, ordered to cross the Volga in a night attack, in scenes very reminiscent of the opening of Saving Private Ryan. They just had to go in armoured boats to take this embankment, met by heavy machine gun fire and mortar fire and artillery rounds from well dug in German positions. And as my map shows, this is an interactive map, so you can see how they invested the city, and the buildings turn red, which shows you how far into the city they got very quickly, within 24 hours. But then as those buildings slowly turn back to black, it shows you typically the Germans attacked successfully. But that's the scene. This sets the scene for the next 2.5 months of fighting. It didn't really change. These 2 divisions, and then obviously other units came in as these divisions started to take massive losses. Other regiments came in to support and reinforce them. But this was a proper meat grinder that went on for the fight for the heart of the city. And like I said, as they change, you can see one building in the center turns a kind of lilac blue, like very bright blue. That is Pavlov's house, and that was in the center. So Pavlov's house, this is the man himself on the left-hand side. This is what he looked like to an eager Soviet citizenship who wanted to read about this house. And like I said, this house it's a metaphor for the battle itself. So it's one house that was fought over, as the legend goes, for 58 days. 28 guardsmen invested the house and held off a division. And funnily enough, all 28 guardsmen, they came from a spread of all 15 republics in the Soviet Union. So they were well represented. It's a propagandist dream. And the next set of photos, you can see this is the man who basically, arguably, it's not a harsh word to use, basically invented the story. The guy on the left is a war correspondent, Lieutenant Julius Shapurin. He was a playwright in civilian life, which bodes well for what he was about to do. And he was looking for a feel-good story, because you've got to remember, when he's discovered Pavlov's house by mid to late October, and the fighting had been going on for weeks and weeks, the city was almost captured by the Germans. They captured over 90% of the city. They'd already flown the flag in the center of the city to say we own it, and the Nazi leadership in Berlin were heralding these photos. So the Soviets needed some kind of feel-good story, lots of feel-good stories, to tell a depressed nation that the city wasn't captured and it was still being fought for. So in Pavlov's house, that's standing in no man's land, The area was now quiet. The fighting had moved, like I'd said. The Germans had captured most of the centre of the city. They now moved their attention to the north of the city. If they captured the whole factory district, the city was theirs. And that's where all the fighting was going on from late October, really through to the main Russian counterattack in mid-November. So Shapurin goes to Pavlov's house it's quiet. The 71st Division, the German 71st Division opposite them, and the 295th Division, who's with them, they're kind of in rest mode. They've been bloodied so much, they haven't got the strength to attack this house en masse or all the positions that's facing them. So Shapurin was well protected and confident that he could go into the house, not be harmed. He interviewed the people that were there, heard about this Sergeant Pavlov who'd first taken the house with his storm group of 3 or 4 men, and constructed the narrative. So he constructed this narrative of it was 28 men that took the house, when in reality, as I've seen from the testimonies, when I've read about all the men that were on within the division on the front line, in and around the house, hundreds of men got transferred in and out of this position in no man's land because they were taking casualties, because they were still getting bombed and they were still suffering artillery rounds and the odd infantry skirmish, but that was about it. But it's a huge building and it needed lots of men to fortify it properly, which they did. And so the testimonies I'm reading were saying, well, I was there. I remember Pavlov. He wasn't in charge. Lieutenant Afanasyev was in charge. And so that just builds up layer by layer what actually happened. And that's what I talk about in the book. But to fast forward, you've got the end of the battle now. So it's end of January. The 80th anniversary is about to come up in a couple of weeks' time. The Soviet famous counteroffensive Operation Uranus, which kicked off on the 19th of November and the 20th, encircled, we're talking hundreds of kilometers in and around the city. It wasn't just the city itself. It was the whole Stalingrad front. It collapsed under the weight of this enormous surprise attack by well over 1 million men and hundreds of new T-34 tanks. That was the brainchild of Marshals Zhukov and Rokossovsky, and it worked. So, like I said, fast forward to the end of January, and this surrounded Sixth Army, which the Russians thought they probably might capture, or encircle, I should say, about 100,000 troops, not knowing that they'd actually encircled well over 300,000 troops. Famously, you've got the airlift that they tried because it had worked the year before. As I said at the top of the talk, it had worked before. That was Hitler's policy again. But equally, he needed to shore up the southeastern front. If Stalingrad fell too quickly, the Soviets could push west a lot quicker too. And he still had hundreds of thousands of men, tanks, and motorized divisions deep down in the south trying to capture the oil fields. He needed to extricate them and get them to a safer position. So the Sixth Army really became the canary in the mine, and they were there to soak up as much punishment as possible while the new front was established, this new defensive front. But it was a disaster by any stretch of the imagination. This whole successful army, like I said, it had been called the Conqueror of Capitals, came up short. So the next photo shows you they're in rags, they're frostbitten, they're emaciated, they're suffering diseases like dysentery, diphtheria, pneumonia. And of the 90,000 that would walk into captivity or be marched or trudged along into the Russian steppe, into the freezing Russian steppe, at least 40,000 of them would be dead by that summer alone, because they weren't in any condition to be marched out into freezing conditions to makeshift camps that they had to, in most cases, make themselves. And so it was a survival of the fittest. And that's what happened. And that's why by the 1950s, only 5,000 of them left to come home to. By the time of summer of 43, and the German armies are going to be defeated at the Battle of Kursk, by then there was about 70 to 80,000 Stalingraders had moved back to the city, started to be rebuilt. And it would take a long time. And it takes money as well. And this is part of the story which I found fascinating because it ties into Pavlov's house. It's twin stories. So what happened was a very savvy Communist Party member, Alexandra Cherkasova, wrote to the local newspaper, the local party newspaper, and said, the city's destroyed. I want to help rebuild it. I want to do it for free. I will volunteer my whole local Communist Party cell. We will pick a building and we will rebuild it, and we will do it for free. It's the communist way of doing things, and we will show that the city can be reborn, I suppose. And the first house that they chose to rebuild, because they'd heard so much about it, because it had been in the press and it was a propaganda propagandist dream, we will rebuild Pavlov's house. So Pavlov's house was the first house that they rebuilt. So on the left-hand side, you can see Cherkasova herself with the materials that she was going to rebuild with. And on the right-hand side is school children looking at the Pavlov's house being rebuilt, and with the graffiti saying, "We will rebuild glorious Stalingrad." And that took on a momentum of its own, as these things do, because obviously it's a propagandist dream. And Cherkasova became almost like a poster girl of the communist spirit and desire to rebuild the shattered cities from the Second World War. Because obviously you're talking about millions of man hours that will be for free, that the Soviet system depends upon to try and rebuild a shattered economy as well. So you've got the poster girl, but you need the poster boy. And that's why Pavlov was taken in and given every single award, which the next photo you can see. This is Pavlov in the early 70s. And as you can see from all those medals on his chest, he was given every award going. And it's amazing. I mean, he was a brave man, don't get me wrong. He was seriously wounded 3 times in combat at various stages of the war. And he ended up being a lieutenant by the end of the war, lieutenant of artillery. But he was assigned to be part of this campaign to show that Pavlov's house had been rebuilt. Here's Pavlov himself, and him and Cherkasova would tour the Soviet Union on a campaign, a feel-good campaign to say, we've done it, we're doing it for Stalingrad, we can do it for the other cities. Ironically, because of what's going on now, a lot of those cities were in the Ukraine. So Smolensk, Sevastopol, Kyiv, obviously, Kherson and Odessa. These are all cities that needed to be rebuilt and would be. But Pavlov was not only this peasant boy from 50 miles outside of Moscow, who was semi-illiterate, but he would learn to read and write. He was moved into Moscow. He was moved into the elite part of Moscow. His children had elite education. They went to university. He was put on probably one of the highest political bodies it's possible to be on, the Supreme Soviet. And again, he was awarded every medal. And from the testimonies that I was reading, so you can see on the right-hand side, this is Radimtsev's guardsmen meeting up in a kind of Saving Private Ryan or Band of Brothers sort of thing. These veterans got together every year to reminisce about what they'd done. And what they had done was amazing. They'd retaken this embankment at great cost. So of the 10,000 guardsmen that had crossed that night in the Volga to retake the city, less than 300 survived the whole battle. They were obviously reinforced with replacements all the time, but the original 10,000 decimated. And that division is a metaphor for all the divisions that suffered in Stalingrad. I mean, the average life expectancy for a Soviet guardsman in the city fighting was 24 hours. And well over 1 million were either dead or 1.5 million, I should say, were either wounded or killed in the Battle of Stalingrad. But the testimonies were saying that it got to the point by the 70s where Pavlov wasn't going to the veteran reunions. And I would probably argue that was because he was getting so much criticism, or maybe ribbing, as we call it, from his fellow comrades saying, well, why the hell have you got all these awards? We know what happened. We know the commanders and the chain of command that you served in. And there wasn't 28 men in the house. Hundreds of men served in the house. And it wasn't the Alamo style fighting that we're always told about. It was a much broader length of fighting along the whole frontier. But anyway, that's what happened. So the next photos show you some of the men that I looked at from their testimonies. The larger picture on the right hand side in color, that's Pavlov's Colonel Yelin. And again, I was looking at lots of testimonies from him saying in one letter, he's writing to the museum director saying, well, he was awarded the Order of Lenin. I didn't even recommend him for it. I didn't even sign it off. Then his battalion commander is top of the picture with the fez on. That's Captain Zhukov. And again, there's lots of letters and lots of testimony from him arguing the point of it wasn't one-man show. Lots and lots of men served there. And I know because I commanded the area and I sent them in. And then Pavlov's direct commander is Lieutenant Afanasyev, and that's him on the bottom left. And again, it's quite a sad story. He's obviously been told to just go along with the party line. He retired from the army injured. I think he became a teacher from what I read from the records. And he didn't get awarded pretty much anything, really. He just obviously got back to try and have a civilian life and live the best life he could. And he would go to the veterans' reunions. Then to finish off, just to show you, and this won't happen because obviously what's going on in the Ukraine at the moment, but I was lucky enough to see some of these guys. It's an international group of military archaeologists who go into the Russian steppe and excavate what they find there, because you got to remember, millions of people fought in this campaign, and every year they were finding and excavating at least 300 corpses, Russian, Romanian, Hungarian, Italian, and German, obviously, and they would be given a proper burial in the huge sites that are located outside of the city in a place called Rashoshka, and depending on which army you served in, you will be buried in obviously their cemetery site. There's two main sites. On one side is the big German one, which is paid by the government there. The German government pays for its upkeep. And on the left-hand side is the enormous Soviet cemetery. So that's my talk. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I'm very happy to take some questions now from the audience.